Okay, so what happens in this region in World War One is what's going to change the Baltic people's histories forever, because it's going to be the first emergence of the modern states that we see today in this region, although there's going to be adjustments with borders over time. But we see for the first time the emergence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. How do we get to that? Well, the war begins in 1914. Russia fights Germany during World War I, and so this region of peoples are fighting Germans, although there are, of course, Germans who are loyal to Germany during this time period, but generally we're talking about, the average recruit is recruited into the Russian Empire's army. In 1915, Germany is able to make its first inroads in this area and controls Lithuania. And in 1916 and 17, the Russian Empire does quite poor in the war, and in 1917, the February Revolution, the first Russian Revolution, the second being the Bolshevik in October, the first in February occurs. And it's during this time period that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania see as an opportunity to establish their own state. In 1917, with the October Revolution of the Communists, this region supports, especially in Estonia, supported the coup led by Lenin. And as a matter of fact, the Estonians played a vital role in that revolution. But we're going to see what's going to happen is there's going to be this constant change of power relations near the end of the war in this region, and there's going to be widespread atrocities on all sides. You're going to have atrocities being committed by the locals against locals, and locals versus the invading forces. There's going to be atrocities of Germans against Baltic peoples. We're going to have atrocities on the communist side against the Baltic peoples. And this melee really of terrible things happen in this area. And some of the people that get their first experience in the witnessing of such brutal events will later be part of the Nazi regime. And when we wonder what the psychology of these people are, what they've seen and what they've done, many of them get their feet wet in the Baltics, and it's kind of like the first, act of what's going to happen later on in World War II. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania established some degree of, pushing for independence, and then in 1918, Germany again takes control, but this time of the entire region. So in 1918, Germany has total control, and that's going to last all the way up until the peace agreements in 1918 at the armistice. Remember, in November of 1918, Germany is defeated in the West. Well, they have to give up their possessions in the East, and the agreements they made with Russia under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when the Soviet powers made an agreement to end the war with Germany on the Eastern Front. And this is a time period again of chaos as the German forces leave. Wars of independence basically occur. So from 1918 to 1920, there are what they consider wars of independence against remaining Baltic German soldiers, or just German soldiers. There's fights against communist forces, and this continues all the way up, again for 2 years up into 1920. and most of the treaty agreements are made with the newly formed Soviet Union. So in 1920, there's an agreement made, the Treaty of Tartu, which gives basically gave Estonia freedom from the Soviet Union. There's the Treaty of Moscow, which was between Lithuania and the Soviet Union, and the Treaty of Riga between Latvia and the Soviet Union. And basically what happens here is the Lenin and realizes that, with his own civil war happening, he cannot put the forces needed in this area. And in many ways, this gives this area up, and and obviously Stalin is later going to have a desire to get this back into the fold under the Russians later on. But during this time period, they don't have time to really deal with the Baltics, and it's in that favorable position for the Baltic nations that they first emerge as independent nations. And as independent nations, they first established themselves as parliamentary democracies, and as the 1920s and 30s progress, each of these nations are going to leave behind those values and establish authoritarian governments. They're not dictatorships, as maybe to the degree of Mussolini or Hitler, but more control is put into the hands of the leaders of each of these nations. And they really, when we talk about the history of Central and Eastern Europe, the only nation that's remains true to democracy during this interwar era is Czechoslovakia, and of course that's the nation that Britain kind of serves up to Hitler in 1938. So the 1920s and 30s, though, is this a time period of freedom for these people. So language-wise, and the establishment of a national of governments, national governments, and peoples, and literatures, and schools, and it's a heyday really of the Baltic life. And when they look back on this era, it's kind of like the beautiful time period, even though the 1930s is a difficult time for all nations of the world, really, because of the depression that's going to hit. And this is when you see this establishment of authoritarian regimes in each of these areas. The Baltic peoples are united during this time period. They see that they are vulnerable on both sides, on the German side and on the Russian side. They make neutrality pacts, they make pacts of defense, they make non-aggression pacts with the Soviet Union, hoping that will hold out, and of course it's not going to. And this era is a time of establishment with relations, foreign relations with places like the U.S. and United Kingdom. And they're hoping that the West might come to their aid if things should change. And they want the West to keep these new borders for them. Lithuania has its own problems in the early part of this era as well. And it's Lithuania is connected to Polish history much more closely. In the early 1920s, Poland tries to, as its own established new nation, tries to unite with Lithuania like they had been united once in the past. So Lithuania had more to fight off in the early 1920s. But generally, it's a time period of progress for each of these nations, and a time of freedom that they're going to long for once that's lost during World War II and when they're put under the yoke again of the Soviet Union. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the last section.